Hi, Teresa here from Parenting for Social Change, and thanks for joining me today. This video is actually in follow-up to an earlier video, an article that I had posted on my website that generated some really great Facebook conversation and follow-up. So I wanted to do a second video around emotional control and emotional presence. And the question that came about in the Facebook conversation was referring to the article that I wrote, which I'll link to in the information below the video. So if you want to go to the article and read it, you can. But in the article, one of the things that I mention is that it can be really helpful when we are in a place where we have gotten angry, we've been yelling, there's been some negative interactions that we've created with the children in our life. Like in that moment, how do we create some context for the child to understand that perhaps what happened is that we weren't reacting to what they did, but we were reacting to some past emotions that we hadn't integrated, that were still looping and coming back to us, and that allowed us to be triggered by the behavior of the child in that moment. And so I want to kind of talk through that process and how we can do that. Like, what does that look like in real life for me? How do I do that? And how can that really create better communication between the child and I, and allow them to see that when I'm human, and for me to be able to be accountable for the actions that I take or the behavior that I might have engaged in when I was triggered. So I want to talk about what happens before I'll call it the incident, right? Before I'm angry and yelling or upset or frustrated or saying something that's hurtful that I probably wouldn't say if I hadn't been triggered. And, one of the things that I started doing in my own life to create more presence and mindfulness was doing small little things on a daily basis. I used to think of mindfulness as needing to be able to spend a lot of time meditating every day, as a parent with 2 children in my life and working as well and all of these things. I just couldn't imagine how I could spend any time meditating. It wasn't going to happen. I do some more meditation nowadays, but and if you've read the book, you know that I say that. So one of the techniques that I started to use to create a greater presence with myself and with the children in my life was really some things that are recommended on lots of websites, on lots of places where people have information about creating mindfulness and presence. And one of the things is just to breathe. To breathe deeply 3 times, and I started trying to do that on a regular basis. Maybe I hadn't reached the point yet where I was ready to explode and something was going to come out, but I might try to notice that my jaw was really tight. I'm clenching my jaw, I might be clenching my hand, and then noticing where that pressure is for me, and trying to do 3 deep grounding breaths. So that's something that I practice on a regular basis, so that when I'm in the moment and I want to try to kind of bring myself back to some place of groundedness and centeredness and presence, that deep breathing becomes more automatic. So there's some things I think that we can do before we get into the situation where we're triggered. And deep breaths on a regular basis, putting up little post-its around the house that say breathe deep, take a moment, whatever it may be, to help you remember to kind of integrate that into your life in some way. But let's say you're in that moment and you're triggered and it's just coming out, right? I experienced that last night in the middle of the night, which is the daytime for the youngest son in my life. But anyway, when you're in the middle of that place, I think what's really critically important is to have some way to bring some physical awareness and presence. So breathing deep, if you can remember to do that. Sometimes you might just touch yourself or tap yourself to kind of bring yourself back to your body and to how you're feeling. Because the idea is when you're triggered and you're in that moment, you just start running, right? Emotionally, you're thinking, words come out of your mouth that you probably would never say any other time, things that could be really hurtful. So breathing deep, finding a way to tap yourself to kind of bring yourself back, and create some space for you to get some reconnection to yourself. Now, if you have really young children, this can be hard to do. You You might not necessarily be able to set a toddler down. They might want to be with you. So mentally, you might only be able to take that space as opposed to physically being able to leave the room. But if you are able to leave the room and, sort of detach yourself from the intensity of that space and in that moment with the child in your life, then that's a great way to kind of bring yourself back so that you physically can move away, not in a way that's punitive for them, but in a way that allows you what you need to do to get to a place where hurtful things aren't going to come out of your mouth, or you're not going to yell. You may yell anyway. Okay, so that happens. We're not about beating ourselves up because we're not perfect. So starting in that place so that you create some presence for yourself with yourself. And what you might do is begin, if you can't leave the room, begin to notice, what are the thoughts coming into my head? What am I thinking? How am I feeling? I will have this internal dialogue in my head. I'm really angry. I'm feeling really angry. I really shouldn't feel angry. He's just 5. Or that's a normal thing for him to do. He does that all the time. Well, I shouldn't tell myself that I shouldn't feel angry because that's not going to be helpful in this situation. I feel really guilty. Whatever, all those things that come into your life. There are times when I might even say to myself, I really hate this. I'm really hating this situation right now. I'm really frustrated. I really wish I could just walk away and leave. Whatever those things are, if we can create some acknowledgement of those feelings within us and sort of give them that room to just be there internally, that's what it means to create some presence and space for those feelings and to acknowledge and allow them to be there. And then when you come to that place where you've kind of let those quote-unquote negative feelings out, even just internally, maybe you walk out of the room and you talk to yourself, maybe you're just having the conversation in your head, whatever it may be, then when it's been a situation where I might have yelled at Grayson, I might have said some things that I wish I hadn't said that were hurtful, I will go back to the child and check in and see how they're doing. And, I might figure out ways that work best for them for me to come back. And Martel and I have often had conversations about that. Like, what's helpful to him when this has happened? And Grayson and I, now that he's getting a little bit older, have had those conversations. And the child might have different preferences. For some children, saying I'm sorry may not work for them. That may not be what they need to hear. What one child in my life prefers is for me to say, I really love you, and not to start out with, I'm sorry. So as children get older, often then we're able to come back to them in ways that work for them and to understand that, so that we're trying to meet their needs for reconnecting to each other and being able to reconnect over whatever, past that conflict, past the ways in which we may have hurt their feelings. So what I will do, often in just a really short sentence, is that I try to create some context for that, to name the situation and what was happening so that the child has some understanding that I was in that moment and I yelled and I was angry. And what was really happening for me is I was remembering a similar situation. This is what I'll say. I was remembering a similar situation when I was a child, and that brought up a lot of sadness. It brought up a lot of anger for me. And so I was reacting to that. I might say that in a much shorter way, depending on the age of the child or what they're doing, and they may not even want to hear it, and that's okay too. Maybe you just need to say it to yourself if the child has moved on and they don't need you to come back. So checking in can be important, and then just creating some context so that they understand that the anger that came out that was directed at them, or the sadness or the frustration, whatever those feelings were, had not to do with them, although they may have been the trigger for it, but what it really had to do with was some past unintegrated emotions that you had from your own childhood or from some other experience that was brought up in that moment by whatever it was that they did. So this is my follow-up. It ended up being a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but it kind of gives you an idea about how you can really create some emotional presence, create some space for yourself to reconnect to what's going on with you, create a better sense of grounding around it, a greater sense of acceptance of where you're at, and then from that place being able to go back to the child, to reconnect, to see if there's something that needs to be said more, to come back together and heal whatever happened between the two of you as a result of you being triggered. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today, and thank you for your commitment to transforming childhood, parenting, and transforming the world.